So, we've been through the major provisions of the UN Charter that deal with international security. But what about peacekeeping? You know, the blue helmets. Probably the most visible contribution of the UN to international security. Where does peacekeeping figure in the UN Charter? Well, it doesn't. Peacekeeping represents an innovation. The first peacekeeping operation was established in 1956 in the Middle East following the withdrawal of British, French, Israeli, and Egyptian forces from the Suez. It was thought that some military presence was needed to prevent the resumption of hostilities, to keep the peace, in other words. And so it was decided to send lightly armed soldiers to serve as a buffer between Israel and Egypt. Now, some people date peacekeeping from 1948, when the first UN observer mission was established to supervise the implementation of the truce after the 1948 War of Independence. But in that case, unarmed observers were deployed, whereas in 1956, lightly armed soldiers were used. Now, I want to say a few words about peacekeeping because it is, as I said, one of the most important contributions of the UN to international security. Because peacekeeping falls between pacific measures, Chapter 6 of the Charter, and enforcement measures, Chapter 7, it's sometimes referred to as Chapter 6.5. We can define peacekeeping operations as UN operations in which international personnel, military and civilian, are deployed with the consent of the parties and under UN command to help control and resolve an actual or potential international or internal conflict. The idea behind peacekeeping is a simple one. Suspend the conflict and thus lower the temperature and gain time to allow the parties to the conflict to negotiate a settlement that will resolve the conflict. In other words, peacekeeping is meant to create space for diplomacy to work. Peacekeeping is not peace enforcement, otherwise known as warfighting. Peacekeeping succeeds not because the UN deploys overwhelming force. UN peacekeepers, as I said, are only ever lightly armed, and that's for self-defense. No, peacekeeping succeeds because the parties to the conflict want the peacekeepers there, because as UN forces, they're trusted to be impartial. Now, what I've been describing is what's known as traditional peacekeeping, lightly armed soldiers deployed with the consent of the belligerents for the purpose of maintaining a ceasefire. And from 1956, or 1948, until about 1987, that's the only kind of peacekeeping there was. But then two things happened with the end of the Cold War. First, there was an explosion in the number of peacekeeping operations. From 1948 to 1987, there were a total of 13 UN peacekeeping operations. Since 1987, there have been 53 new operations. In other words, 4 times as many in the past 25 years as there were in the previous 40 years. This year alone, there have been 15 active UN peacekeeping operations. The total cost to the UN of running those operations, incidentally, is $7 billion US. Now, the UN is sometimes criticized for being bloated and inefficient, but just to put those costs into perspective, the US was estimated to be spending more than $6 billion a month on just its operations in Iraq in 2007. All right, so that's the first change that occurred with the end of the Cold War, a surge in the number of peacekeeping operations. The second important change that's taken place is with regard to the nature of peacekeeping. The UN mandate has expanded considerably in this regard. These forces are no longer just keeping the peace. They're also responsible for ensuring the delivery of humanitarian aid, for organizing and observing elections, for disarming and demobilizing armed forces, for training police, for verifying compliance with human rights agreements, among numerous other functions. Indeed, in a few cases, Kosovo and East Timor, for example, the UN's been responsible for governing the entire territory. These operations are sometimes referred to as complex peace operations to distinguish them from traditional peacekeeping. Okay, but peacekeeping is just one instrument that the UN uses to promote peace. There are 3 other broad areas of UN activity in relation to international security. And I'll mention them briefly.